Hello, everyone, and welcome all to our ACM talk for November, titled The Ambassador is Spoiling Us, Gifts and Material Diplomacy at the Courts of Siam and France at the end of the 17th century with Professor Giorgio Riello. The ACM talk series brings leading scholars in conversation with curators at ACM to explore our core curatorial themes: maritime trade, faith and belief, and materials and design. And this is actually the last ACM talk of this year. So we take a break in December and we'll see you again in January 2022. Just want to thank the Chris Foundation for their generous support of this webinar series. We are recording today's session and it will be available on our ACM Facebook page afterwards. So my name is Conan Cheong. I am a curator at the ACM and I'll be your host for this event. Our program is 1 hour long. And we will take some questions from the audience at the end of the session. So please type any questions you may have at the Q&A box, chat box at the bottom of the screen. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this evening. Giorgio Riello is Chair of Early Modern Global History at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, and Professor of Global History and Culture at the University of Warwick, United Kingdom. He is the author of Cotton, the Fabric That Made the Modern World, Cambridge University Press, 2013, Luxury, A Rich History, 2016, and Back in Fashion, Western Fashion from the Middle Ages to the Present, 2020. He has published on global trade between Europe and Asia, and on material culture and fashion in the early modern period. He has recently co-edited Global Gifts, 2020, and The Right to Dress Sumptuary Practices in a Global Perspective, 2019. And he is currently completing a book entitled Cultures of Innovation, Silk in Pre-Modern Eurasia, and developing a project entitled European Factories of the Indian Ocean, 1600 to 1780, considering the system of trade in the Indian Ocean. So we're really lucky to have Professor Riello here today to speak to us. And without further ado, please, Professor Riello.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And I'm going to share my screen. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Very sorry about this. Here we are. So what I would like to talk to you today is about the ways in which ambassadors in the pre-modern period, let's say from 1400 to roughly 1800, were somewhat not greeted with sympathy or treated with respect or as friends if they did not have appropriate gifts during their embassy. And such gifts included a variety of items, what today we call decorative items, very often of very high value. And these were gold and silver artifacts, they were jewels, adorned with precious stones. The same could be said of clocks, porcelain, mother-of-pearl vessels, textiles, especially expensive silks, and sumptuous clothing were equally important, as was food, animals, and rarities within embassies. Rulers across Asia, for instance, were also used to bestow so-called robes of honor to the most trusted of their servants, but also to ambassadors, foreign ambassadors, and these ambassadors were carrying back these robes of honors to their respective countries. So gifts were very much at the core of ceremonies that accompanied the formal reception of foreign ambassadors. And this was the case both in Asia and between Asia and Europe. And this is very much the context, for instance, in India. The case that I want to consider today is a case that relates to the two distant kingdoms of Siam and France in the 1680s. I promise this is the only table I have in my paper. So let me summarize these embassies. As you can see from this table, you have so-called 4 embassies that happen in the space of just 5 years between Siam and France. Siam, present-day Thailand, and France is more or less the present, the Kingdom of France is more or less the present-day France. 2 were from France to Siam, and 2 from Siam to France. So ambassadors in both directions, by the way, moved in French ships. The final distinctive element of this diplomatic relationship is the number of texts that were produced. That is the column on your right. 8 main texts were produced by some of the people who belong to the entourage of these embassies. And you probably see number 5 is also a fragment from a text that comes actually from Thailand, but is only a fragment of the period in which the Siamese ambassadors spent in France in 1686. Now, let me just pause for a second to reflect on the fact that when we consider embassies in this period, we are in the 17th century, 2 concepts are very important, and they are that of reciprocity and that of incommensurability. So reciprocity is a concept that is borrowed from gift theory and therefore from anthropology, and implies that embassies are a reciprocal act. Indeed, gifts sent by one sovereign to another, as in this case, are seen in the context of a reciprocal act of exchange. However, this is not in no sense to be taken as either precondition or the admission that the 2 parties are on equal footing. What is central is very often that the concept of reciprocity creates a bond between equals or unequal that is meant to be overcome and overcome the difference between the 2 parties by establishing a relationship that is mutually accepted, in this case, very often via the forms of gifts. So you might say that gifts themselves create reciprocity. The concept of incommensurability is in many ways in opposition to that of reciprocity. It acknowledges that whatever the link, the bond, or the relationship created between the 2 parties, an unbridgeable gap might exist that prevents the full recognition and understanding of each other's actions and motivations. Yet again, the sending of an ambassadorial mission might be the first step to create common ground, you might say, and therefore gifts, once again, are attempts at creating a shared language that is not spoken, but very often it is material. So these are part of concepts of what we can now call the new diplomatic history, that argues that gifts are not just props in a relationship, but actually come to constitute a diplomatic relationship itself. Now, historians come to this realization a bit late, in the sense that museums have already done quite a lot of work in this area, acknowledging the power of things in creating diplomatic relations. And here I cite a few examples. In the mid-1980s, and again in 2014, the first Siamese embassy that is part of my talk today to France, and its gifts were the subject of an exhibition at Versailles. Gifts in early modern diplomatic relations have found also a great deal of interest thanks to a series of other exhibitions. Here I cite mostly examples from the Western world, but there are other examples as well. For instance, the exhibitions such as the Tsar and the East, that was originally held at the Sackler Gallery in 2009. Gifts of the Sultan, that was originally at LACMA in LA in 2011, and the Treasure of the Royal Courts, that was at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2013, that were also occasions for the wider public to see a selection of those precious artifacts used in diplomatic exchanges in the early modern period, in particular in the relationship between Europe and Asia. So it must be said that one of the problems of the diplomatic history of Siam and France is the imbalance created by the fact that one of these embassies, this is so-called the first Siamese embassy to France in 1686, has received a great deal of interest, and as I said, was also the subject of the exhibition, of two exhibitions in Paris. Enormous quantities of gifts were presented at the court in Versailles in September of 1686. And as you can see, I show you a series of engraved images representing of what happened in these embassies. To give you a sense of the scale, 54 items, 54 gifts were presented by the King of Siam to the King of France, 59 items from the Siamese Prime Minister to the King of France, 53 items from the King of Siam to the Dauphin of France, and so on. The list is incredibly long. As many as 132 bales of presents were sent, so many that at departure in Thailand, 2 elephants for the Kings of France's grandson had to be unloaded at the last minute because there was no space. And the document said that this was much to the relief of the captain of the vessel, because as you can imagine, it's very difficult to transport 2 elephants across the world in the early modern period. The gifts included a variety of items familiar to 17th century European elites, such as porcelain cups, vases, ewers, trunks, cabinet, coffers, and Japanese screens. Some of them were made of tambak, that is an alloy of copper and gold. Several were made of silver and pure gold. Others were lacquered. The majority of the gifts came from Japan and China, areas with which Siam had extensive commercial and diplomatic relations. We know about these objects thanks to the complete lists that were attached to the so-called harangue, the speeches given by the Siamese ambassadors at the court when they arrived at the court of France. Prints are of great help because one of the problems is that none of these objects survive or are traceable with certainty. So a print like this shows the coffers full of Japanese lacquered objects decorated in tambak, or I give you a more precise screenshot of this. The 2 pieces of canot 6 feet long that you see on the right, or the small golden bottles from Japan. So it has been argued that the Siamese gifts and the 1686 embassy were appropriated by Louis XIV, the King of France, in an attempt to elevate himself to the rank of an Asian despot. The gifts were part of what we today call a PR exercise, a triumph for Louis XIV of France, with an embassy being presented as an alliance between the 2 great kingdoms of France and Siam, and to a certain extent also an act of submission to the greatness of Louis XIV. And these were supposed to seal a commercial agreement, securing France privileged access to the Siamese ports, and to establish bases from which France could trade from Siam to China and Japan. There was also a rumor that the King of Siam was considering converting to Catholicism, a fact that was perceived in France as a confirmation that this active relationship was with the King of France, the very Catholic King of France, and indeed the presents were the testimony of all of this. So as you realize, a lot of bold claims were made around these gifts, these diplomatic gifts. And it's no surprise that they came under enormous scrutiny. For instance, the famous French artist Charles Lebrun decided to draw some of these items. The value of the gifts themselves was key to convince France that Siam was one of the richest kingdoms in Asia, and therefore a priority for France to secure, for instance, trade. Yet not everyone was impressed. The documentation says that there were different opinions on these. Some argued the presents were very fine, but that Siam was actually not a kingdom of fabled richness. And this would explain why its king, unlike Louis XIV of France, had to get hold of the gifts somewhere else, namely, as I said, China and Japan. But someone also disagreed about the value of the gifts themselves, saying, and here I quote, that the gifts of the king of Siam sent to the king of France and to the Dauphin consisted of a great number of rather ugly porcelain pieces, a few Chinese cabinets, rather indifferent. I should add, and this is a parenthesis that we might have the chance to discuss later, that we cannot disentangle things from people. Equally discussed were also the Siamese ambassadors, and in particular his chief ambassador, Kosa Pan, who toured Paris and the north of France during the several months of their stay. The other issue here is that what happened of these gifts? As I said, none survived, and partially this is because the French royal family had a very pragmatic vision or approach to the issue of diplomatic gifts. Clearly problematic because of their sheer quantity and size, already quite visible at the audience. After a grand dinner in honor of the ambassadors, the Siamese ambassadors, the Dauphin, who is the son of the king, organized a lottery in which the Siamese gifts were distributed among courtiers. So the gifts had clearly performed a public function, but you might say that in a private one, they did not essentially match the expectation of the King of France and the royal family. All of this is the perspective from the side of France. A different picture, however, emerges from Siam. As I said, the two embassies were sent from France to Siam, the first of which was a relatively large embassy comprising 265 men, they were all men. As only two vessels were made available, the entourage had to be kept to a minimum. In fact, later on, embassies tend to be much bigger. And they had to be kept to a minimum partially because there had to be space for the gifts sent from France to Siam. It was estimated that the gifts that Louis XIV of France sent to the King of Siam were valued at 300,000 AQ. That was an astronomical figure. And again, we know this by looking at the accounts. The Siamese part of these reciprocal relations shows the great importance given to the gifts presented at Versailles by the Siamese ambassadors in 1686. Indeed, the French were quite surprised with the treatment given to the presents that they were carrying from the King of Siam. Part of the issue was that whilst Europeans saw the gifts as a series of expensive commodities, the Siamese treated them as an emanation of the persona of their king. The 1686 profusion of gifts at the Versailles ceremony thus assumes a rather different meaning, one of necessary reciprocity among so-called brother kings, than a form of respect to Louis XIV. So the Siamese ambassadors probably must have been mortified by the way in which Louis and his court treated their gifts and eventually disposed of these gifts. So on the one hand, here I claim that Louis XIV had a very commodified view of the gifts, these diplomatic gifts, and he understood the importance of magnificence that was required in this occasion. The French king was convinced by his inner circles that a large embassy was required to be sent back to convert Fra Narai. As I said, the religious aspect was also important. So what did France send back to Siam? Again, as I said, there are detailed records of the goods that were sent during the two embassies. And among these commodities, the most singular of the kingdom, so the choice on the part of the French was really here I show you a page of these accounts, was to choose commodities from France. The French sent 5 clocks, 2 of which with pendulum, furniture, crystalware, gold watches, gold crown with diamonds that was worth 13,000 livres. That was again a very high sum. Clothing, saddles and harnesses, court swords, 12 muskets, 8 pairs of ornate pistols, 2 miniatures of Louis XIV painted on enamels and garnished with diamonds, a chest full of medallions bearing the French king's profile, an equestrian portrait of the Sun King. The gifts to Phra Narai, the king of Siam, from Louis XIV were worth an astonishing, you can see the figure there, somewhere 175,000 livres, without including the so-called personal gifts sent by courtiers. And the gifts were acquired from the royal repository and from several of the crown suppliers in Paris, and included also mirrors, sedan chairs, crystal mirrors decorated with precious stones, crystal candelabras and chandeliers, savonnerie carpets, gobelin tapestries, marble tables, an organ, porcelain vases of Sèvres, and all sorts of exquisite furnishings, the document says. The latter gifts were not a random selection of goods. They served to furnish the new audience hall at the Palace of Lopuri in Luovo today. Tashad, who was one of the people involved in the second embassy, recounts that, and here I quote, the audience hall at the Palace of Luovo is completely covered in huge mirrors, which the King of Siam has caused to be brought from France. Phra Narai was an avid collector, not just of Asian luxury, sorry, I didn't put the quote, but also of the best that could be found in Europe. He seemed to have surrounded himself with a mixture of luxury items from Europe, Japan, China, and Persia to form a rather eclectic style in his palaces. Part of the royal palace was indeed built in Persian style. In fact, at the same time in which the French arrived in Siam, also an embassy from Persia arrives there, creating a lot of problems as well. But by the 1680s, when these embassies take place, the King of Siam seemed to be more interested in what I call European exotica. In fact, the Dutch East India Company, the DOC, and also the English East India Company were well aware of the king's many passions and had furnished him with jewelry, coral, amber, diamonds, glass, perfume, horses, birds of paradise, and also a lot of cloth. In 1682, so 3-4 years before our embassies, the Dutch had contributed to the construction of the whole Alupure by supplying as many as 162, and here I quote, very elegantly colored glass panes or panels ordered specifically from Holland by His Majesty. And here I try to put a 17th century mirror next to this image because it gives you a sense of how the wall would have looked like if those squares are mirrors. And they also sent marble, gold cloth, lace procured from Holland, and many other things. So the gifts presented by the Dutch East India Company and also by the English and also the French companies were often requested gifts. In fact, the difference between a gift, something that is requested, and something that is purchased is actually very difficult to establish, as the King of Siam would let the Europeans have a list of what he required as gifts. A kind of wedding list, you might say, in which you put forward what you would actually want. And this was partially due to the fact that the king controlled all international trade. So trade with the kingdom was done with the king in the form of gifting, for which in return the companies would receive the kind of commodities that they needed for the intra-Asian and the European trade. So the murkiness between gifts and purchase was present also in the more rarefied ambassadorial relations between states. The quantities of goods that the Siamese ambassadors acquired in France was absolutely prodigious. So apart from the gifts, they also purchased a lot of things. They often asked for the type of goods that were technically impossible. For instance, mirrors that were 20 feet high, that was impossible to produce in the early modern period, or cannons that could hold balls of 300 pounds in weight. They had to content themselves, so to say, with 4,263 mirrors of different dimensions from the factory of Saint-Gobain, that were both for the Palace of Lopuri and the Palace in Ayutthaya. And also 4,300 pieces of crystal fruit and flowers, as well as chandeliers and candelabra. They were accompanied by no less than 7 savonnerie carpets, extremely large, as well as a large quantity of textiles, velvets, and linens. This large quantity of stuff clearly awaited in Siam together with the second French embassies. And it was reported, and here I quote, that some parts of this palace were not really fully decorated yet at the end of the second embassy. What is striking in reading this list of gifts received by the King of Siam is that they were carefully chosen and indeed supplemented, as I said, by purchase to fulfill the king's ambitions and passions. In this sense, they were very dissimilar to what was defined as indifferent gifts that we received, that were of great effect, but they were probably unwanted. The King of Siam expressed instead his personality and ambition through the gifts he received. He was a man of great culture. He was said to be extremely well informed about European politics. He was extremely inquisitive. We know this from the reports of the French ambassadors, and showing profound knowledge on several topics. The presents to the King of Siam therefore acted as a reminder of the cosmopolitan horizon of the Siamese rulers and his erudition. If Louis XIV gave body to his claims to Oriental-like power, the King of Siam instead associated his own intellectual and cultural ambitions to the presence of Western commodities, Western goods, and also the appreciation of different cultures. Now, let me move to the final part of my talk, and a third point. I've considered the perspective from France and the perspective from Siam, but there is another point of view in this story, and that is the point of view of ambassadors and what we might call the social lives of embassies. And what I would like to do is to try to understand what was their position in all of this. So apart from gifts from king to king, the success of an embassy was secured on the ground. And this did not involve just two parties, in fact, two kings that never met, but involved a variety of actors, among which, very importantly, the ambassadors themselves and their entourage. So this is one of the areas in which a lot of work has been done in recent history, diplomatic histories. And here I go back to the diaries that I mentioned at the beginning because they're quite revealing. One of them is, for instance, a very successful 2-volume work that was published by Gita Shah, that you see in here, who was a Jesuit. He was part of the French embassy, in fact, at both embassies, but was not an ambassador. He was also a very mistrusted and much disliked man because of his duplicitous role. But his own recounts, among the others, gives a striking different perspective, you might say. He reveals, for instance, that the Dutch and the English had already invested great sums in terms of gifts presented to the King of Siam over the years. They knew well that to receive gifts of more limited value back or having an audience postponed, delayed, or indeed cancelled was a clear sign that the relationship was under strain. Although the Siamese king was not keen to scorn the rather powerful Dutch or English, other more subtle messages were sent concerning the weakening of their position vis-à-vis the increasing power of France. For instance, the frantic unloading of French gifts on the shore of Siam was kept no mystery. In fact, it was much publicized. The Dutch knew that as part of the so-called Second French Embassy, the King of Siam had received gems and pearls, accompanied by lace, glassware, and hats. Moreover, they were also aware that Monsieur Constance is also called Falcon, the Greek-born favorite that acted as de facto prime minister of Siam, had been honored by the King of France, and here I quote, with various valuables and moreover with the portrait of the King of France in gold with a crown set with diamonds on the one side, and on the other a falcon, from which you realize the falcon, with a lily on one claw with the inscription, be faithful. This was, as it was allegedly reported by a captain of a French ship that arrived in Malacca. This was reported to the Dutch in 1687. So the Dutch were very well informed about what was happening with the English, what was happening with the French, what was also happening with the Portuguese in Siam. But in the case of the French, the message could have not been more clear and personal. The Dutch commented, for instance, that upon the fact that the French were now in the favor of the king, as the portrait of the King of France had been received with great honor by the King of Siam. Falcon was somewhat freer than the king to make a very public display of the gifts that he received from France, and this was done in front of the Dutch and Portuguese, and with the understanding that their alliances, the kingdom's alliances, were changing. Cheong, that was the ambassador of the first French embassy to Siam, recounts that I saw very well, here I quote, that under the pretense of a combat of elephants, he, Falcon, was minded to make these presents that were given by the King of France in the sights of several Europeans who were present, to give a public mark of the particular distinction that he would make of the French nation. So Falcon, to give you a bit of context, had arrived in Siam in 1675, so a decade earlier, and quickly had secured for himself a position at court. He later rose to become the chief advisor to the king. He was very much disliked by the Dutch and the English, and therefore he sided with the French and used gifts both as to signal his position and to gain further support from France, as he was secretly trying to negotiate a military occupation by France of Siam in order to ensure political stability for himself and the king. The just sheer number of gifts was one of his weapons. So he gave a lot of gifts to the ambassadors. Even Tachard, that I mentioned earlier, who was one of Falcon's best allies, thought that Falcon had slightly overdone it. And here I quote, because he says that they seemed to be of such considerable value, these gifts, that for some time it was thought by many that they had been sent by the king and not by Falcon himself. In this sense, Falcon was able to play on one of the many well understood and rather conscious incommensurabilities that characterize these Franco-Siamese relations. As noted by another ambassador, Lalubert, he said, an ambassador throughout the East, throughout Asia, is no other than the king's messenger. He represents not his master. That's to say, he explained that in Asia, they honor him little in comparison of the respect which are rendered to the letters of credence whereof he is the bearer. So he's saying that unlike Europe, in which, in a sense, an ambassador stands in for a king or ruler, this was not the case in Asia. And this will explain why only meager gifts were therefore given by the king to the ambassadors. By contrast, the king of France had given presents to the envoys and ambassadors from Siam. They were not much different, perhaps in quantity they were different, to those that he had sent to the ruler of Siam. So effectively what Conan had done, he has exploited this difference of attitude in the position of the ambassadors in his retinue to perform a function of a European king. If on the one hand he had avoided embarrassment, on the other he had created an awkward situation, as French ambassadors seemed all too aware of their low status in Asia, something that could be not hidden in ceremonies. So let me go towards the end of my story, a kind of epilogue. Because if in 1686 the Siamese ambassadors had been received with an unprecedented welcome in France, by the summer of 1688, 2 years later, little had remained of Louis XIV's enthusiasm. When in July of that year, the second embassy returned to France, the king was not pleased to receive contrasting reports. The French ambassadors made it clear that the king of Siam was never going to convert to Christianity. And indeed, the value of the Siamese trade was not perhaps worth the gain, you might say. None of them, in fact, had any idea that in the meanwhile, the king of Siam, and indeed also Conan, were dead, and that the French had been annihilated in Siam. Louis XIV of France, having obtained the publicity that he wanted, now considered how best to untangle himself from future embassies. So he unwillingly consented to receive the Siamese ambassadors, to then change his mind and send them off to Rome for an audience with the Pope. And this allowed Louis XIV to withdraw from granting more concessions or investing further resources in what looked like a rather unpromising initiative. Some of the presents for the King of France were therefore recycled for the Pope. So undelivered gifts and an embassy that was never received effectively ended the Franco-Siamese relationship in the 1680s. The exchange of embassies between France and Siam was also a short one and ended in failure rather than the establishment of cultural or economic connections between these two parts of Eurasia. You might say that Louis XIV never fully appreciated the gifts from Siam, while the Phra Narai, the king of Siam, instead treasured them. And yet none of the gifts survive or are traceable today in both countries. I show you, by the way, the print from the 1680s and the present ruin of the palace. In conclusion, in this short paper, I have attempted to explain the motivations around this famous and somewhat unexplained case of diplomatic exchange. I've emphasized the ways in which gifts created commensurability, but also allows for the agency and power of individual characters, not just kings, but also ambassadors, adventurers, and religious men. Conan will be discussing the ways in which we might want to critique the very concept of reciprocity and whether it might be actually a hindrance rather than a form of help in our explanation. So I look forward to his response and to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Riello, for that really fascinating lecture. And yeah, I mean, today, Professor Riello has really vividly described this sort of moment of cross-cultural exchange, the sort of thing that we're really trying to manifest at the galleries at ACM with our Asian export art trade galleries, where royal gifts exchanged between Siam and Ayutthaya and France in the 17th century overcome the cultural incommensurabilities between the two kings and the two kingdoms acting as a shared language. And in some ways, it's kind of tragic to think that only very very soon after in 1688 with the revolution in Ayutthaya and the execution of Falcon and Phra Narai. These efforts kind of seem to end in a bit of a failure. But in my response, I just want to expand a little more on Thai Buddhist practices of gift giving. And I just hope this, let me just share my slides. I hope this adds to, let me just, yeah. And I hope this kind of adds a bit to complements Professor Riello's presentation, and then later I'll pose a few questions to our speaker. So, just the wider context of gift giving in 17th century Ayutthaya obviously is Buddhist practices of gift giving and generosity, and the term dana in Sanskrit and Pali is translated often in English as generosity, but encompasses many forms of gift giving, and it's highly theorized in the Indic religions, and also very relevant even today to the practices of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism in all over the world. And what's really interesting to me in relation to Professor Riello's presentation is what Rieko Onuma notes, that in Buddhism, as in Hinduism and Jainism, the concept of dana is most commonly described as a specifically religious gift directed at particular types of recipients, and as a gift that must never be reciprocated. So, in contrast to the reciprocal gifts given in a diplomatic context, where the values of the gifts are highly scrutinized in order to make sure that they're at the same level of reciprocity. Here we have the idea of a non-reciprocated gift, or a gift that cannot be reciprocated. And the reason for this really stems from the Indic distinction between seen and unseen fruit. So while a reciprocated gift produces seen fruit in the form of the gift that you receive in return, it is not able to produce an unseen fruit, which in the Buddhist case is a kind of transcendent karmic reward, a spiritual merit or punya, which can lead to a better rebirth in the next life, and then ultimately enlightenment or nirvana. And so one example of this, as you see in this illustration from Laos, is the Buddhist layman giving alms to a monk who is not expected to reciprocate. And so, yeah, so this is a theme that really recurs in Buddhist culture, in the stories of the Buddha's past lives, the Jataka tales, with the Vesantara Jataka being one of the most popular examples, about a king who gives everything he has, the rain elephant that's important to his kingdom, the kingdom itself, and even his wife and his children. And it is this act of generosity that leads him to be reborn as Prince Siddhartha in his next life, where he would eventually gain enlightenment and become the historical Buddha. So scrolls like this 33-meter long scroll in the ACM collection are actually commissioned and donated to museums in northeastern Thailand as an act of to gain merit in the same way. And in the ACM collection, we have several of these monks, gifts that will be given to monks. These are examples of some alms bowls, where very elaborately decorated. In the middle one with mother of pearl and lacquer, the one on the right in lightly beaten silver. So monks in a Buddhist context, monks are considered very productive or very worthy fields of merit. So giving a gift to such a worthy field of merit, you will actually gain even more merit than you would give to a gift to somebody else. Yeah, and you see this also in the 17th century, this sort of account in the Royal Chronicles of Ayutthaya, which one other example of a kind of unreciprocated gift is offerings made to the Buddha, or the renovation of important religious sites, in this case, footprint of the Buddha, that Phra Narai was said to have manifested his holy compassion by having repairs made to this building. And this actually brings me to the king's role in Buddhist polities. Certainly, Phra Narai in the kingdom of Ayutthaya as a Chakravarti, or kind of an ideal Buddhist king, who, in this, can be traced to very early sort of Indic ideas of kingship, where the Chakravarti, or the universal monarch, is seen to be endowed with a kind of mystical power or charisma. And this is very linked to his kind of identification with the Buddhist faith, as an upholder of the Buddhist faith. And one of Phra Narai's titles, as stated in the Chronicles of Ayutthaya, is the Supreme Holy Buddha Lord Omnipotent. And his ambassador, Kosapan, represents himself as the servant of the Holy Buddha Lord. So it's really interesting to think, in relation to what Professor Riello was talking about, with how Louis XIV and his ambassadors, one of their motivations were actually to try and convert Phra Narai to Catholicism. So it's interesting to think about this kind of religious, how religion really plays such a big factor in these, even in these diplomatic relations. So, in relation to other Buddhist kingdoms and also kingdoms in the region of Southeast Asia, this charisma of the king as the ideal, Chakravarti, is quite clear. And I just bring up the well-known example of the Bunga Mas. These are described as gold and silver flowers in the historical chronicles of the region that were actually given to Phra Narai to Ayutthaya by states in the Malay Peninsula, such as Terengganu, Kelantan, Kedah, Patani, and Yala. And depending on who you ask, was it a tribute given by a lower status political entity to a higher status one, or was it a gift, worthy gifts of mutual friendship, like what we saw with Versailles? Again, in the Ayutthaya Chronicles, there are these examples of how countries in the region were imbued with fidelity to the king, to the Holy Buddhist Lord, and prepared gifts to him, and were then rewarded in turn by gifts from the king of Ayutthaya. And so you see here, gift giving is again a way to express your overlordship over certain territories, and how an act of a kind of subordination. So in the ACM collection, we have this offering tray, and this it's a later. I'm talking about later period now. In the reign of King Chulalongkorn of the present Bangkok Ratanakosin dynasty. This was actually given to the Admiral Andreas de Richelieu, Danish admiral, and the first and only foreign-born commander-in-chief of the Royal Thai Navy. And this gold tray and official robe, which are now in the ACM collection, were given to this Danish admiral as a commemoration of his long career. And what this kind of stems from is when the Thai king bestows a rank upon someone, he provides the recipient with all the equipment required for him to perform duties within the Thai court. So things like this robe was a uniform that would be worn during audiences with the king, and access to these items, which are made in court workshops, were highly restricted. So this is the kind of the rank, the award that was the medal that was given to Admiral de Richelieu in this. On this occasion. So again, gifts being used by the king and Ayutthaya, and in later periods, to establish these subordinate hierarchies. So finally, actually, I would just like to talk about this era, which I just want to thank our longtime supporter of the museum, Peter Lee, for bringing this to my attention. And sorry, Professor Riello, I added this after I sent the slides to you earlier. So this piece actually really interestingly was given part of the embassy, the Siamese embassy to Louis XIV in 1686, and it was actually acquired in 2018 by the Chateau de Versailles, and classed kind of national treasure by the Ministry of Culture. And one of the rare pieces that survived, that was not melted down, and actually was in the collection of a noble aristocratic family, French in France, and very recently sold to the Chateau de Versailles. And Chinese export silver at the ACM. We also have these very similar objects that were very similar form. That were traded in a more, perhaps a less rarefied context, and just really interestingly speaks to what Professor Riello was talking about, of how the Thai, it was seen as perfectly appropriate for the king and Ayutthaya to give objects made in Japan and China as diplomatic gifts, and as kind of a proof of the cosmopolitanism of his kingdom. So yeah, just to kind of end my response, I would just like to pose a couple of questions to Professor Riello. The first, I'll just give both questions, and Professor Riello, you can answer as you wish. The first really is interesting to me because Eurasian interactions in the colonial period are often portrayed in terms of European companies like the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company aggressively seeking these trade concessions, and later effecting territorial expansion and resource exploitation from reluctant Asian polities. So what Professor Riello has already done here in the study of gift giving and diplomatic gift exchange, is this more productive in counterbalancing the Eurocentric historical narratives than just focusing on commercial exchanges? So this is what my first question. The second question is really about the sources that Professor Riello has been using. It's interesting that recording the gifts is also an important part of the gift exchange. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the prints, the portraits, and the sketches that commemorate these embassies that are produced in France, especially in relation to how the ambassadors and their gifts were depicted. Who commissioned them and for what purpose, and who was eventually the intended audience. So yeah, let me stop sharing my slides here, and yeah.
Thank you so much, Conan. I'll be very, very short. It's a great pleasure to see actually that at least one of the objects has been so-called found, one of the ewers that I mentioned, and it's part of now the National Treasure of France. As to your first question, indeed, there's been a lot of emphasis on the commercial relationship that, as you said, is being set within a narrative of increasing and encroaching European power in Asia. And diplomacy is a counterbalance act, especially diplomacy that did not lead to a good and long-lasting relationship to the advantage, you might say, of Europeans. The particular emphasis given to France is also quite interesting because in the history of, so if you take a perspective that is very French focused, the presence in Asia of France is really an 18th century phenomenon. It's not really a 17th century phenomenon. So it's a very small player compared to other European nations as well, both economically and politically. And in that sense, to see that what a specific king, clearly with great European ambitions, is able to do in a context that is outside Europe is quite revealing of specific dynamics that are not per se, as you said, Eurocentric, because they find in the context of Ayutthaya, of Siam, a very different setting. And all of a sudden, many of the claims that you find about European superior attitudes, European organization, and sometimes also European economic power kind of fizzled out very much. And this is very much in the accounts that I discussed earlier. Concerning your second point about the sources, I might share my screen very briefly again because I have a few more slides. I'm not. Here we are. And sorry, this is not. Why is it not giving me?
If you click the resume slideshow.
Yeah, let me just see. It doesn't allow me that there is this one. So sources like these are what to be found in the archives in Paris, the Bibliothèque Nationale. These are, of course, manuscripts. And I cannot seem to be able, well, I'm happy to have just this image that I hope you can see. And then you have lots of prints. So the visual materials are used in two different ways. The visual materials, especially those created in Siam, this is the eclipse de soleil. So it's a sun eclipse in Siam in 1688, in which there is a group of Jesuits that is able to predict for the king the eclipse. And it is a very important event because the king is very into astronomy. Is part of a production that is actually not very often goes into printing in Europe. However, and I've shown you several prints of the reception of the Siamese ambassadors in France, those are very much circulated. So they create a lot of publicity, and not just with the act itself, the presentation of the gifts, but also with these several prints that are today to be found actually in several different museums. There is you might say, a visual culture and a printed culture, these embassies, that you realize has been quite the backbone of my presentation. Although I focus on material exchange, but having now we know only one object that can be attributed to these embassies. What I had to do is to use the visual and also the archival, the lists. But you have, the visual constitutes really an important part because it also physically represents the ambassadors. And that's part of what is called siennoiserie, a fashion for Siamese things, and as a bit of an invented style that you have in Siam, in France, in the late 17th and early 18th century.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, I really found this, your attempt to recreate the social life, as you said, of the embassy is really fascinating. And, to think about how it's kind of, even today, in the way that, that piece that was from the embassy has been classified a national treasure. How these, the histories of these embassies actually still play a part in the way that France and maybe Thailand sees itself as a nation, as nations. So we actually, we're already kind of at the time at 8 p.m. But I just wonder if there are any questions that we can take from any quick question we can take from the audience at this point of time. Otherwise, we've actually run out of the time we have tonight. Okay, I don't really see any questions from the audience. So do you have any other things to add? You wanted to add, Professor Riello, to close?
I think apart from thanking you, Conan, and the museum and everyone attending, and you made my day by showing me the objects that I didn't know the existence of that has been attributed recently. So I hope I will have the chance in due course to see it, and also to see the wonderful similar objects that are in your collection.
Great. Yeah, I hope to be able to welcome you to the museum soon once all these travel restrictions are over. And so that brings us to a conclusion. Thank you very much, Professor Riello, for your time, and also all of our dedicated audience for your time and attention. So we will take a break in December, and then we'll see you again in January. So in the meantime, have a great, I guess, a Merry Christmas and a great end of the year. Please help us improve the ACM webinar experience by scanning the QR code on your screen, which our colleague Junhao, he's just flashed it. So with that, thank you all very much. Please have a good, lunch or dinner wherever you are in the world. Thank you. Hey, I think, yeah, thanks so much. And I think we can log off. I think, perhaps Professor Riello, maybe I can quickly introduce Clement On, who's Deputy Director of our Curatorial Department here at ACM.
Hi, Giorgio. How are you?
I'm fine.